A father's love knows no bounds, but when his daughter's heart is shattered by an act that questions her identity, how far will he go to protect her? This is a story of courage, of standing up when the world tries to silence you, and of a parent's unrelenting fight for what's right. A simple act, cutting her hair, was only the beginning. What happens when a father takes on the system itself? In the tranquility of a quiet suburban town, life unfolds in familiar rhythms. For many, it's a place where the everyday worries are small: bills to pay, soccer games to attend, the occasional school project. It's a place where parents find comfort in the thought that their children are safe, growing up in an environment that supports them, nurtures them. But sometimes, in a moment of silence, something happens, something that shatters that comfort, something that changes everything. Meet James Thompson, a devoted father who thought he knew everything about his daughter's life. Mia, his bright and joyful 9-year-old, was his pride, from her infectious laugh to the way she wore her hair in thick braided strands. Her braids had become her signature. They weren't just hairstyles, they were an expression of who she was, a reflection of her culture, her identity, her connection to the past. Braids that told a story that no one should have the power to cut away. For Mia, this was just another ordinary day. She didn't know it yet, but that morning, when she walked out of her house with her braids tightly woven and her spirit high, things would never be the same again. It was supposed to be a regular school day, a day of learning, of friendship, of discovering the world around her. But Mia would never make it to the end of that school day without experiencing something no child should ever face. What Mia didn't know was that her braids, the same braids that had been a symbol of her individuality and pride, would soon be seen as a problem, a distraction, an issue that needed to be fixed. It wasn't long before the teacher decided that Mia's hair was too much, too bold, too different. A teacher, the very person entrusted with nurturing and guiding young minds, took matters into their own hands. The lesson that day wasn't about history or math. It was about power, control, and a shocking violation of trust. Without warning, the teacher cut Mia's braids, her beloved braids, right in front of her classmates. For Mia, it was a moment of disbelief. How could anyone take something so personal, so sacred to her, and just cut it away? In that instant, her sense of safety, her sense of who she was, began to unravel, and yet in that very moment, a father was about to be thrust into a battle he never imagined he'd fight, a fight to protect his daughter, to restore what was taken from her. When James received that call, he thought it was just another update about school activities, a typical conversation, but the voice on the other end told him everything he needed to know. His daughter was upset. There had been an incident, and suddenly the world around him went silent. As the words sank in, James's heart raced. How could this happen? James didn't just hear the words, he felt them. His daughter, his little girl, had been violated in a way that no parent could ever prepare for. And so the questions began to flood his mind. What had happened? Why did it happen? Who gave this teacher the right to decide for his daughter, and above all, how could he make this right? What came next was something no one could have predicted: a father's fury, a daughter's heartbreak, and a confrontation that would not only expose a grave injustice, but would challenge everything the school thought they knew about respect, boundaries, and the dignity of a child. Mia walked through the school halls like she always did, smiling, confident, and full of life. The world was her playground. It was supposed to be a day just like any other. The morning bell had already rung, the lessons were set to begin, and Mia was ready to tackle whatever came her way. But as every parent knows, children have no way of knowing that sometimes things can go terribly wrong. What Mia didn't expect was that today, the very thing that made her unique would be the reason she was about to face a nightmare. Mrs. Turner was known for her strict discipline, a teacher who valued rules, order, and structure above all else. There was no room for exceptions in her classroom, no room for what she saw as distractions, and Mia's braids, those bold, intricate twists, were a distraction. At least, that's what Mrs. Turner thought. From the moment the class started, Mrs. Turner's eyes kept returning to Mia. It wasn't the lesson she was focused on, it wasn't the students who were distracted. No, it was Mia's hair. The braids that hung down her back, the ones she'd so carefully braided that morning, had become the center of the teacher's attention. "Mia, I need to talk to you. Your hair, those braids. They're too distracting for the class. You're not focusing and it's making it difficult for your classmates to concentrate. I'm going to have to do something about it." Mia had no idea what was coming. She had always loved her braids. Her mom braided them every Sunday evening, and Mia wore them like a badge of honor. But in that moment, her pride and joy became a problem. To Mrs. Turner, her hair was an obstacle, a distraction that had to be removed, regardless of the cost. Mia told, "Wait, please, no, what are you doing?" But it was too late. Mrs. Turner's decision was made. In the blink of an eye, she started cutting Mia's braids, those long, cherished strands that Mia had always loved, snipping them one by one as the classroom remained eerily quiet. Each cut was like a knife to Mia's heart. Mia told, "Please, I don't want you to cut my hair. It's important to me." Mia's voice broke through the silence, but her plea went unheard. Mrs. Turner continued, seemingly unfazed by the pain she was causing. She cut through Mia's braids as if they were nothing more than an annoying piece of hair that needed to be trimmed. To Mrs. Turner, it was about control, about enforcing rules. But for Mia, this wasn't just about hair, it was about her identity, her heritage, her culture. As Mia's braids fell to the floor, her classmates sat frozen, unsure of how to react. There was no comfort, no intervention. Mia was alone in that moment. She could only watch as her identity, her most treasured physical feature, was stripped away piece by piece. Each snip of the scissors echoed in her mind, a reminder that she had no control over what was happening to her. And with that final cut, Mia was left staring at the floor, her once beautiful braids now scattered around her feet. Her hands were still shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. The weight of it all. How could anyone do this to her? How could her teacher, the one person she was supposed to trust, treat her like this? Mrs. Turner told, "There, now you can focus on your work, Mia." But Mia wasn't thinking about her work anymore. She wasn't thinking about math or history. She wasn't even thinking about the lesson. She was thinking about the overwhelming feeling of shame and confusion that filled her chest. How could something so deeply personal be taken from her in an instant? In that moment, Mia felt something shift within her, a loss, a deep hurt that she didn't know how to name. The teacher's actions had left an indelible mark, one that went far beyond hair. It was a betrayal of trust, a violation of her sense of self. And though the rest of the world seemed to move on, Mia's world had come crashing down. As the school day ended, the world around Mia carried on as if nothing had happened. But Mia knew differently. Her braids, those pieces of her identity, had been taken from her, and though she was just a child, she knew something was wrong, very wrong. And so, as Mia stood in that classroom, alone and broken, a father's heart was about to be torn apart. The phone call James received that afternoon would mark the beginning of a battle that no parent should ever have to fight. For James, it was just another afternoon, a moment to unwind after a busy day. Little did he know, the phone call he was about to receive would turn his world upside down, igniting a fire within him he didn't even know was there. He picked up the phone, expecting the usual school updates, maybe about Mia's performance or a reminder about a parent-teacher meeting. But what James heard on the other end of the line wasn't the usual small talk. It was a voice filled with concern. It was the voice of the principal, Mrs. Walsh, who, with a sense of urgency, informed him that something had happened to Mia, something that James would later describe as unthinkable. The principal explained that Mia had been upset all afternoon and needed to be picked up early from school. She didn't go into the specifics over the phone, but promised James that they would explain everything when he arrived. James's heart began to race. Something in the principal's voice unsettled him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew something was wrong. His mind raced through 100 possibilities, none of them good. Was Mia hurt? Had something happened at school that he wasn't aware of? He tried to call her, but there was no answer. His worry deepened with every minute that passed. When James arrived, Mrs. Walsh was already waiting for him. She was standing near the office, her expression grave. She didn't waste any time. Without much preamble, she explained that Mia had been upset all day because of something that had happened in class. She told James that Mia's hair had been cut by her teacher, Mrs. Turner, a teacher whom James had trusted to take care of his daughter. James stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His daughter's hair, her cherished braids, had been cut by her teacher, the very person who was supposed to protect her, to encourage her to grow and express herself, had taken something that meant the world to Mia. The anger swelled within him, but it was quickly followed by a deep, aching hurt. How could this have happened? As Mrs. Walsh continued to speak, James found himself lost in the whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. How could a teacher, someone entrusted with shaping young minds, decide to cross such a line? Mrs. Walsh explained that the teacher, Mrs. Turner, had cited Mia's braids as a distraction in class. She claimed they were impeding Mia's focus and that of her classmates. So, in her mind, cutting them off was the solution. The more Mrs. Walsh explained, the clearer it became. Mia's braids weren't just a personal style choice to Mrs. Turner. They were a problem that had to be dealt with in the most humiliating way possible. James felt a sickening pang in his stomach as he imagined his little girl sitting in that classroom, watching helplessly as her identity, her pride, was literally sliced away. James told no one has the right to do that to my daughter. This is unacceptable. We need to fix this immediately. James's anger had reached a boiling point, but beneath that anger was something far deeper, a protective instinct, a father's need to defend his child. He wasn't going to let this go. No one could make Mia feel ashamed of who she was, not her teacher, not anyone. He made a decision then and there. He would confront Mrs. Turner. He would make sure she understood the gravity of her actions. James didn't care about the protocol anymore. He didn't care about the school's rules. All that mattered was that someone had hurt his daughter, and he wasn't going to let it slide. As he walked towards the classroom, Mrs. Walsh trailed behind, trying to talk him down, but it was clear that nothing was going to stop him now. His mind was set. James walked into that classroom, his heart pounding in his chest, and there, sitting at her desk, was Mia, broken but still his little girl. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, her hands trembling as she reached out for him. In that moment, everything else faded. It was just him and Mia, nothing else mattered. James could feel her trembling in his arms, and his anger reached new heights. No one should ever make a child feel the way Mia did in that moment. The teacher had taken more than just her hair. She had taken Mia's sense of security, her confidence. James vowed to fix that, to make sure Mia knew that no matter what anyone did to her, her father would always be there to fight for her. The time for words was over. James wasn't just a father now, he was a protector, and this battle, this fight for his daughter, was only just beginning. After picking up Mia and calming her down as best he could, James knew there was only one thing left to do: confront Mrs. Turner. The teacher, the one who had betrayed his trust and destroyed something so precious to his daughter, had to answer for her actions. It wasn't just about the braids anymore, it was about respect, dignity, and the boundaries that should never be crossed. James had never been a confrontational man. He had always believed in calm discussions, working things out, and following the rules. But this was different. His daughter's trust had been shattered, and in his mind, Mrs. Turner's actions weren't just a mistake. They were an assault on Mia's very identity that could never go unaddressed. As James stepped into the teacher's lounge, he could see Mrs. Turner sitting by herself, her back to the door. She hadn't anticipated his arrival. She didn't know what was coming. To her, the action had been simple: cut the braids, eliminate the distraction, and move on. But James wasn't going to let it go that easily. James told Mrs. Turner, "We need to talk, right now." James' voice was unwavering, a quiet storm ready to break. There was no softness in his tone, no diplomacy, only the force of a father who had reached his limit. Mrs. Turner told Mr. Thompson, "I'm assuming this is about Mia. We can discuss this calmly, but let me remind you, I was only trying to help her focus." Her words dripped with condescension, as if she were the rational one trying to steer Mia onto the right path. James could feel his blood boil. There was no apology in her tone, no recognition of the harm she had caused, just a rationalization of her actions. James told, "Help her focus? Is that what you call it? You cut her hair, Mrs. Turner. You cut my daughter's hair without her consent, without anyone's consent. What kind of teacher does that?" The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. James's voice didn't waver, but the weight of what he was saying seemed to land with a thud. Mrs. Turner didn't seem to flinch, but something flickered in her eyes. Was it guilt or just defensiveness? Mrs. Turner told, "It was necessary, Mr. Thompson. Mia wasn't paying attention in class. Her braids were a distraction, and I had to do something about it. This isn't the first time I've had to address behavior like this." There it was again, the same justification, the same rationalization. Mrs. Turner spoke as though she had done nothing wrong, as though her actions were justified by the simple fact that Mia wasn't meeting her expectations. But James wasn't about to let her play the victim. James told, "This isn't about behavior, it's about respect. You had no right to treat Mia that way. You humiliated her. You took away something that meant so much to her. Do you have any idea how much those braids meant to her? Do you have any idea what you've done?" James's anger surged, but so did the pain. It wasn't just anger, it was heartbreak. The realization that someone he trusted to educate his daughter had overstepped, had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. And the more he spoke, the more his pain became clear. His daughter wasn't just a student to him, she was his world. Mrs. Turner told Mr. Thompson, "I understand your frustration, but I was trying to teach Mia a lesson. She needs to understand that school isn't about personal expression, it's about focus and discipline." Her words hit like a slap to the face. There was no remorse, no understanding of the deep personal violation that had occurred. She wasn't concerned with how Mia felt, with what she had lost. She wasn't even considering the bigger picture. She was stuck on a single, narrow vision of discipline, a vision that allowed her to disregard a child's emotional well-being. James told, "What you did was wrong, Mrs. Turner. You crossed the line, and it's not just about the braids. It's about how you handled it, how you treated my daughter like she was a problem to be fixed. You didn't see her as a person with her own feelings, her own identity." In that moment, James wasn't just defending his daughter, he was standing up for every child who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or silenced by someone in authority, and he wasn't going to let Mrs. Turner get away with it. James knew the confrontation wasn't over yet, but one thing was certain: the battle lines had been drawn. This wasn't just about the braids anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, and James was ready to fight, no matter the cost. As James prepared to make his next move, one thing was clear. This confrontation was only the beginning. The fight for Mia's dignity, for her identity, was far from over, and no matter what happened next, James wasn't going to let anyone, least of all a teacher, take that from her. James had been waiting for this moment. After his confrontation with Mrs. Turner, after confronting the painful reality of what had happened to Mia, James knew it wasn't enough to simply demand answers from the teacher. The entire system needed to be held accountable. The school board, the very ones responsible for overseeing what went on within these walls, had to face the consequences of their inaction. Miss Brooks told Mr. Thompson, "Thank you for joining us. Please take a seat. We understand you have serious concerns and we want to hear what you have to say." The tone was polite, almost rehearsed, too calm for what James knew was a volatile situation. He had no illusions about what this meeting would be like. The school board, in all likelihood, would try to downplay the situation, brush it aside as a misunderstanding, or worse, shift the blame onto someone else. But James wasn't here for politeness or half-hearted apologies. He was here for justice. As the meeting began, James felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. He was outnumbered in enemy territory, but he wasn't backing down. He had come here for one purpose: to make the school board understand that what had happened to Mia was not just a simple mistake. It was an abuse of power, a violation of trust. Miss Brooks told, "We've reviewed the report and Mrs. Walsh's account of the incident, Mr. Thompson, and while we understand that you're upset, it's important to remember that teachers have a responsibility to maintain discipline in the classroom." Mrs. Turner was only trying to address what she perceived as a distraction. James could feel his blood begin to boil. The board wasn't listening. They were framing the issue as a matter of classroom discipline, minimizing what had happened. James leaned forward, his voice firm and steady, but with an underlying intensity. James told, "This isn't about discipline. This is about my daughter's dignity. Mia had every right to express herself, to be herself. And what did you do? You let a teacher cut her hair, cut her identity, because she didn't fit into some narrow idea of what's acceptable. That's not a discipline issue, Miss Brooks. That's a violation of her basic rights." There it was, the heart of the matter. James wasn't just advocating for his daughter's hair or appearance. He was fighting for her right to exist unapologetically, for her right to choose how she presents herself to the world. And to him, that wasn't just about hair, it was about respect, a value that at that moment seemed sorely lacking at this table. Miss Brooks told, "We understand your frustration, Mr. Thompson, but we also have to take into account the broader context. Teachers are expected to maintain a productive learning environment. If a student's appearance is becoming a distraction to their own learning or to others, action may need to be taken." It was the same tired justification, the same excuse they always used when faced with uncomfortable situations, maintaining order, preventing distractions. But James wasn't going to let them hide behind that. James told, "That's your excuse?" Mia's appearance was a distraction. How? Her braids were a part of who she is. This wasn't about classroom management. This was about control. You were trying to control her identity, to fit her into a box that you thought was acceptable. But it's not your job to dictate how kids look. It's your job to teach them, to nurture them. James, I understand this is difficult, but Mrs. Turner truly believed she was doing the right thing. She has always been a dedicated teacher, and this was a moment of poor judgment, not malice, poor judgment. That was how they were framing it. A slip-up, a mistake, but James knew better. This wasn't just a mistake. It was an overstep, an abuse of power. And it wasn't just about Mia's hair, it was about how easily they seemed willing to dismiss it. James told, "This is more than just Mia. It's about every student who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. It's about the message you're sending when you allow this kind of behavior to happen without accountability. How many other kids have been silenced, made to feel ashamed of themselves? how many other teachers have overstepped their bounds and faced no consequences. The words struck harder than James intended, but they were the truth, and sometimes the truth is what hurts the most. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a cloud. The school board had to face the uncomfortable reality that they were complicit in this. By letting it slide, by downplaying it, they were endorsing this behavior. Ms. Brooks told Mr. Thompson, "I hear you, we hear you, and we will take this into consideration. We will launch a full investigation into the matter and review Mrs. Turner's actions. Please understand that these things take time. We will make sure this is handled appropriately." The words were careful, measured, an attempt to placate James, to offer some semblance of accountability without truly committing to any meaningful change. James wasn't fooled, but at least they were no longer dismissing him. At least he had made them listen. James told, "I'll be watching. This isn't over." For James, the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today he had taken the first step. He had forced the school board to acknowledge what had happened, and in doing so, he had sent a clear message. No one, not a teacher, not an administrator, was above accountability. After the tense meeting with the school board, James had braced himself for a long and drawn-out process. He had hoped for accountability, for real action, but deep down, he knew that change in an institution this large wasn't going to come quickly or easily. He thought he would have to wait weeks, even months, to see any real consequence. What he didn't expect, though, was the call that would come just days later. Ms. Brooks told Mr. Thompson, "Thank you for your patience. I'm calling with an update regarding the incident with your daughter, Mia. After thorough consideration and further investigation into Mrs. Turner's actions, the school board has decided to take immediate action." James couldn't believe it. Immediate action? After weeks of running in circles, of hearing nothing but excuses, now he was hearing that something was going to be done. It was a moment that, for a second, felt like victory, but something in Miss Brooks's tone raised an alarm in his gut. There was a catch. He could feel it coming. James told, "What kind of action?" "You said immediate action, but what exactly are we talking about?" There was no easy way to say it. The school board's decision was swift, but it was anything but reassuring. James could hear the tension in Miss Brooks's voice as she carefully chose her words. Miss Brooks told, "We've decided that after reviewing the situation, the best course of action is to suspend Mrs. Turner for a period of time. However, we are also recommending a mediation session between you, Mrs. Turner, and the school. This will allow for an opportunity to discuss the matter and, ideally, come to some resolution." Suspension. The word hung in the air like a hollow victory. It wasn't a termination, it wasn't a resignation. Mrs. Turner would still return to the classroom after her suspension was over. And as for the mediation, was that supposed to make everything better? A few well-placed words, a handshake, and all would be forgiven? James told, "I'm sorry, Miss Brooks, but I don't understand. You're telling me Mrs. Turner is getting a suspension, but she'll still come back after that? What exactly does that accomplish? What message are we sending here?" He couldn't contain it. The words were a punch to the gut, a slap in the face. What was the point of a suspension if it didn't carry real consequences? This wasn't the justice Mia deserved. This wasn't the accountability he had fought so hard for. And to top it off, this mediation, it felt like an insult. Miss Brooks told Mr. Thompson, "I understand your frustration. I really do." But the school board had to weigh many factors in making this decision. The suspension is a way of acknowledging the seriousness of the incident while also providing Mrs. Turner with an opportunity to reflect on her actions. The mediation is intended to give you a platform to voice your concerns and for both parties to try and find a way forward. It was clear the school board wasn't going to give James what he wanted. They weren't going to hold Mrs. Turner accountable in the way he envisioned. The suspension was a temporary setback, but it would hardly be a punishment for someone like Mrs. Turner, who had already made it clear she wasn't truly remorseful for what she'd done. And the mediation, it felt like a way to smooth things over, to avoid the real confrontation. James told, "Mediation? So you want me to sit down with the woman who cut my daughter's hair and talk it out? That's what you think will fix this? You don't get it, Miss Brooks. What you're offering isn't justice, it's appeasement. You're brushing this under the rug, and I won't let that happen." In that moment, the weight of everything that had happened, the confrontation with Mrs. Turner, the meeting with the school board, the mounting sense of frustration, finally hit James all at once. He realized that he was on his own in this fight. The system wasn't going to deliver the justice he wanted for Mia, but he wasn't going to back down. James told, "I'm done with mediating, Miss Brooks. If you're not going to take real action, I'll take it into my own hands. I'll make sure this isn't swept under the rug. This isn't over." And just like that, something shifted. James had reached his breaking point. The line had been drawn. He had no intention of letting this go, not when his daughter's dignity was at stake. He wasn't going to allow the school to decide how the story ended. He would make sure the world knew what had happened. What James didn't know, though, was that his response, his refusal to accept the school board's decision, was about to set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. A series of decisions, actions, and revelations that would turn everything on its head and lead to an unexpected twist in this already volatile situation. It had been days since James's heated conversation with Miss Brooks, days since he'd made it clear to the school board that he would not back down, that he would do whatever it took to make sure his daughter's dignity wasn't trampled on. Yet, despite the school board's decision, despite the suspension, something about the situation felt unfinished, unresolved. James told, "Hello?" Mrs. Turner told, "Mr. Thompson, it's Mrs. Turner. I know we've had our differences and I understand you're upset, but I just wanted to call and apologize. I know what I did was wrong, and I've thought about it every single day since. I didn't mean to hurt your daughter. Please, just hear me out." The words were unexpected, an apology. It was not what James had anticipated, not at all. He'd braced himself for confrontation, for more excuses, perhaps even more defensiveness. But this was different. Mrs. Turner's voice, tremulous and sincere, struck him in a way he hadn't prepared for. James told, "I appreciate you calling, Mrs. Turner, but I need to know one thing. Do you truly understand the harm you've caused? Do you realize what cutting my daughter's hair meant? Because it wasn't just about the braids. It was about her identity, and her right to express herself without fear of judgment." The question hung heavy in the air. It wasn't about whether Mrs. Turner could apologize. It was about whether she truly grasped the depth of her actions, the ramifications of what she'd done. Because an apology, no matter how sincere, wouldn't erase the damage done to Mia's sense of self. Mrs. Turner told, I never saw it like that. I thought I was doing what was best for the classroom, but now I see how wrong I was. I understand now, Mr. Thompson. I understand." It was as if the apology carried weight, but James couldn't help but wonder, was this genuine remorse or just an attempt to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control? He wanted to believe in the sincerity of the words, but after everything, he couldn't allow himself to be swayed by a simple apology. For James, the question lingered, was this enough? Was an apology, even one that seemed sincere, enough to right the wrongs done to his daughter? He knew that the emotional toll on Mia was far greater than anyone could see. The school might consider the issue closed, but for James, this wasn't just about one incident. This was about every child who had been made to feel less than because of who they were. This was about accountability. The headline made his blood run cold. There, at the bottom of the article, was a shocking revelation. A source, anonymous but reliable, had revealed something James hadn't expected. The school board, under pressure, had only suspended Mrs. Turner for one reason: to avoid a public relations nightmare. The truth? Mrs. Turner had been under investigation for multiple incidents involving questionable behavior towards students, but her suspension had been timed to make it appear as though the school district was acting in the best interests of the community. In reality, it was all part of a strategy to protect their reputation. The truth, as it often does, came crashing down in a moment of clarity. James had been played. The school district wasn't concerned about Mia. They weren't concerned about justice or fairness. They were concerned about optics. They were concerned about saving face. It wasn't over. James had only just begun to uncover the layers of deceit and mismanagement surrounding this incident. The school board had tried to make it go away with a suspension and a quick apology, but James wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug. He knew what needed to be done. He needed to make sure this story didn't fade into the background. Will justice be served? Will the truth come to light? James had taken the first step, but the path ahead was uncertain and the stakes were higher than ever. Mia's story was far from over. The battle for her dignity, for accountability, was only just beginning. Before we dive into the story, we want to hear from you. What would you do if someone harmed your child's sense of identity? How far would you go to protect them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more powerful stories like this one.